This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Hey everyone, it's Mark Baer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode of the show is sponsored by Baer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists get funding, gain influence, and build strategic relationships with the stakeholders who matter most in their professional world. Reaching those goals often involves effective translation of complicated research into engaging, jargon-free communication that boils down complex topics to capture the attention of decision makers and general audiences. Interested in getting a free resource to help you do just that? Go to complexitymadeclear.com to get the 11 keys for translating complexity. That's complexitymadeclear.com to get your free infographic used by science communicators at major organizations to boil down but never dumb down complicated science and technical topics for key stakeholders. I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Sarah Habibi to the show today. Sarah is a molecular biologist, educator, digital content creator, and new mom to her son, Noah. As a graduate of both doctoral studies and education studies, with a specific focus on STEAM education, Sarah has become an expert at communicating science to audiences of all ages. Sarah is passionate about making science exciting, engaging, and educational. She uses the power of social media to promote experimentation in STEAM and enhance student learning through her popular page, Science Bay, on Instagram and TikTok. Well, Sarah, it is so great to have you on the show. And you've had a really interesting, high impact journey to what you're doing now. And so I wonder if you take listeners on that path and what you were thinking, how you navigated it, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what you're doing now.
First off, thank you so much for having me. My path has not been linear in any regard. I started in grad school in my PhD back in 2015, and I started with the thought of, and I'm going to graduate, I'm going to go into academia, I'm going to try and find a full professor role. Along the way, while I was in grad school, I had quite a few people asking me, "What do you do all day? What does a scientist do?" People really had a hard time understanding what does somebody doing a PhD or a master's, what they do on the day to day. And so that's when I started to share my day to day roles, work in a research laboratory, talking about the research I was doing. I was also teaching at the college at the time and just sharing my daily routine on social media. And slowly, as I was doing that, I started to connect with an audience of people who also loved science. And I found that what I was doing was actually called science communication. At the time, I didn't really know what science communication was, but lo and behold, that's what I was doing. And so I went with that. And I've always loved teaching, I've always loved science. And so communicating what I was doing daily in the lab, that's where the social media stuff started. And from there, I was able to grow an audience on Instagram and then soon TikTok once the pandemic happened in 2020 and everybody decided to flood TikTok. And then I graduated in 2020. And that's when I hit my first crossroads of really figuring out, am I going to go down this academic route? Or am I going to go down another route? And with academic jobs, as I'm sure most of your audience is aware of, they're very difficult to get. And unless you're willing to uproot and relocate to other provinces, other countries, other states, it can be challenging. And for me, in the life that where my roots are here in Toronto, it wasn't really an option for me. And so I was very limited in the scope of the universities that I had in my area that I could actually apply for. The jobs were also limited. And we had just gone through the first year of the pandemic. And so actually they were decreasing jobs. Schools were shut down. And so they were reducing the number of courses that were being offered at universities. And so it was just a really interesting time. And that's when I decided go with this other side of work that I was doing, which was the science communication on social media. And I thought, okay, let's try this. Let's go after this full time. And then the rest is history. Now I couldn't imagine going back to the jobs that I was applying for because I'm essentially a full-time science communicator, STEM content creator on social media.
I want to ask you about this because for folks who are familiar with your work, the way you're presenting the information is really creative and
Mhm.
different, unusual. It's like artistry. And when I work with scientists and I talk about the fact that even the word scientist, the etymology of it has its roots in the word artist and knowledge. So I love how you bring that dimension forward. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah. I love how you use the word artistry because I found myself, I've always been an artist. I've always been a creative. Ever since I was a little kid, I've been in all the art competitions. I did all the art courses in high school, yearbook editing, all the digital art forms. And that's really something I was connected to. When you're going on and choosing a career path, there's art and then there's science, and you look at them and you're like, these two don't go together. And one of them is a more well walked path which is science, and there are more opportunity there. And that's why I went down the science route. But then with what I'm doing now, I'm using my creative side, using that art to really make the science that I teach accessible and engaging and fun for really wide audiences to connect with. And my goal is to really just help give teachers and parents and other people out there the tools to integrate this type of science education into their classroom, into their homes, and learning the science behind all of these, the wow factor of these experiments that you may see on social media.
And they're so varied too. You're
Mhm,
doing a lot of different things, which gets me to my
mhm,
next question is how do you think about the creative process? Like how do you decide the it's like the medium almost. Yeah, you might be putting it on social media, but like you're using paints and you're
mhm,
using liquids and fluids and you're doing all these different things.
mhm.
Take us inside your creative process.
I have formal training in science education. And so I have my bachelor's of education for biology and chemistry. I did that prior to doing my PhD. At some point in my journey, I thought I was going to be a high school biology teacher. And so I tap into what I know from curriculum development and lesson planning from my background in education. But then I also just really look at what are people talking about? What are questions that people are asking me? And what are questions I'm asking about the world around me? And that's really how I tap into my creative process. And so, how it was just October, and October, everyone's ramping up to Halloween. And so I thought, okay, what's some science experiments that I know of, and how can I put a fun Halloween twist on it so that kids are doing fun Halloween activities, but they're also learning science? And so I try and tap into my prior knowledge, but also into seasonally what's happening and how can I further get people excited about this science? Because now it's not only a science experiment, but it's a science experiment using a pumpkin and there's like foam coming out of their mouth and it's one with the season.
Yes, so true. It's so
Yeah.
relevant and salient. A lot of people have difficulty in their journey when they're maybe still in the research lab or they're at the library or social scientist, natural scientist, and they are intrigued by and interested in science communication, but have a real difficult time trying to fit that in
Mhm.
to what they're doing at the time, particularly when, perhaps an advisor might not be supportive or they're feeling a lot of pressure from their PI, for example, to get these experiments run.
Mhm.
Any advice to folks who are in that situation?
Yeah. This really speaks to when I first started out and I was doing this while I was working in the lab. And I really just tried to take from the experiences that I was having in the lab on a daily basis. And so, for example, if you're running like a gel electrophoresis, you're running gels all the time. That's something you do all the time. How maybe there's a way that you can communicate it and teach it in a way, tell a story about it and communicate the science there on use this in the lab. Or that's just one example, but really just pulling from your own experiences. And I found that when you do that, not only does it come more naturally to you, but it also saves time because you're not going outside of the box and having to do even more external research because it's already research that you've done and it's already processes that you do on a regular basis. And so that in itself saves time, but also just really scheduling and planning your calendar accordingly. And if it doesn't fit in, then Instagram or science communication, it can wait. Your research is what matters first and foremost. But I really think all researchers and academics should do some form of science communication at a point in their career, especially when they're in that grad school phase, because being able to explain your research to a broader audience and explain that overarching impact and significance of the research is a really important skill to have. And it's something that it kind of bridges that gap between scientists and society because you're explaining it and you're giving the importance of it to people who wouldn't naturally come by that type of research or be exposed to that type of research. And so practicing this form of science communication and storytelling while you're in grad school, I think ultimately will make people better scientists.
Absolutely agree. And you get better and better at it as the more you
Mhm.
practice and get responses back. As we wrap up, I want to ask you what your initiatives are lately, what you're working on now, anything that is over the horizon that you want to share with listeners.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a STEM children's book, experiment book. It's essentially a lab notebook, activity book for children. It is in the final stages of editing. Hopefully pre-sales are going to start early next year, next spring, and then it's going to be released next summer. And so that's something I'm really excited about. You could think of it as a lab notebook, your child's first lab notebook, because they're going to be making hypotheses, making observations, collecting data, looking at results and all of that, and able to actually put that into the book while doing science, fun science experiments. So that's really fun. And just the work that I'm doing on social media, trying to make science more accessible for parents and kids and teachers, that's constantly ongoing.
Yeah, and that is so important. So I want to, first of all, thank you, Dr. Sarah Habibi, for the work that you're doing, making this information accessible. There's so much, of course, COVID was like a historic use case of what happens when the general public doesn't really understand how science gets done. And you're contributing to this effort to really bridge, like you said, science and society so that people can get a better understanding and that benefits all of
Mhm.
us. Thank you for doing that. And we'll have a lookout for your children's book coming out next spring, your child's first lab notebook. It sounds like a really cool, great thing for people everywhere to pick up, even if you
Mhm.
have kids or you have nieces, nephews, or friends. Like it's a
Mhm.
great thing to start kids with, asking questions and doing that. Really
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure speaking.
And listeners, thank you for being along on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.